Thank you. Good evening. Today is Thursday, May 12th, 2022. Welcome to John Law, an Asian American Unitarian in the 1820s. This event will last approximately 1 hour. This opportunity is brought to you by All Souls Church Unitarian in Washington, D.C.
Shige, I think you muted yourself.
It automatically muted me twice, actually. Hopefully it won't again. I'll start over, at least for the recording's sake. And I see that like 5 more people came in. Today is Thursday, May 12th. Welcome to John Law, an Asian American Unitarian in the 1820s. This event will last approximately 1 hour. This opportunity is brought to you by All Souls Church in Washington, D.C., located on the lands of the Nacotchtank peoples of the Piscataway group of tribes. My name is Shige Sakurai, and I go by they, them pronouns. I'm wearing a yellow shirt, and I have wavy black hair. I'm an All Souls member and your host. This event is being recorded and may be archived and made broadly available. Please note that difficult topics may arise in our discussions, including around enslavement and additional forms of violence and power. I encourage you to take care of yourself and to recognize when you or others may be activated and how that could be affecting participation. I also remind our attendees about the All Souls commitments that frame how we seek to behave with each other. This includes practicing warm welcoming, fostering diversity, listening with respect and attention and speaking with care, serving our communities, seeking to resolve conflicts with openness and compassion, practicing forgiveness and reconciliation, and providing solidarity and accompaniment to each other in both times of joy and need. Thank you to the Adult Spiritual Development Committee, especially Justine Rothbart and Ebony C. Peace. Thank you to the Asian American Pacific Islander Souls Group, especially Georgia Yuan, for sending reminders about this event. Special thanks to All Souls congregant Carol Collins for providing our Zoom tech today. Please reach out to Carol in the chat if you have any technology issues that you may need help with. Deep gratitude also to congregant Sunu Chandy, who will be joining with me in our Q&A portion with Dr. Rosemary Zagari. Dr. Zagari, I'm extremely excited to spend this time with you today. And as is common in our congregation, I'm going to light this chalice. The chalice is a symbol of the Unitarian Universalist religion, a symbol created in World War II to aid refugees from Nazism. I would like to settle in and center for a moment and with a very brief reading from the short anthology here called Voices from the Margins, an anthology of meditations. And this piece is from UU minister Reverend Shuma Chakravarti, and it's called God's Tears. I sometimes think the stars are God's tears. Even God's sorrow creates sources of great illumination, joy, and beauty through these celestial bodies. At our very best, we human beings are microcosms, containing within us sparks of divinity. Sometimes I think my own heart, shattered by sorrows, is like a cascade of diamonds. Each piece is valuable and radiant, a source of joy and illumination to beings known and unknown to me, as the stars are a source of strength and radiance to me, although I am unknown to them. I am wishing all of you a wonderful and meaningful Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. The idea for this Heritage Month it originated in the late 1970s, and it was actually set in May for two reasons. One was that May was when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, the tracks laid primarily by Chinese descent laborers. And May was also when the first Japanese person to live in the US arrived, that person being Nakahama Manjiro, who attended a Unitarian congregation in Massachusetts in the 1840s. Just over a year ago, a small group of All Souls congregants representing the Asian American and Pacific Islander Souls group, the Black Souls group, and the Black Men's group met together as part of a Black and Asian dialogue. We met because the Black congregants communities were reaching out to the Asian descent congregants in the aftermath of the Atlanta spa shootings and anti-Asian violence across the country. I heard from multiple folks how important that initial dialogue was and how grateful they were to be a part of it. Solidarities should continue to grow. They are critical in a world that pits us against each other towards mutual destruction. We truly are more powerful together. Well, that small behind the scenes gathering just over a year ago might be one of the first times at All Souls Church that groups of congregants got together for this specific solidarity conversation. It's not the first time we've had individual congregants who have demonstrated their solidarities across Black and Asian descent identities. Frederick Douglass, who was a regular attendee at All Souls in the late 1870s, was an outspoken critic of the anti-Chinese sentiment that led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And we are just now learning the story about John Law, one of our first All Souls donors and congregants during our founding in 1821. He was a lawyer of Indian and British heritage who defended Black clients in court seeking freedom from enslavement. Today, we will get to learn more about what we know and don't know about this history from a distinguished scholar. I suspect that a deeper meaning making around this may also be a longer term project. And with that, I would like to introduce our special guest for the evening, Dr. Rosemarie Zagari. Dr. Zagari has her PhD from Yale and specializes in early American history, particularly early American women. Dr. Zagari has received numerous prestigious research fellowships, has published 4 books, and is currently working on a new book project entitled Liberty and Oppression, Thomas Law and the Problem of Empire in Colonial British India and the Early American Republic. She works at George Mason University as a university professor titled, which is the highest professorial rank at the institution. Dr. Zagari, welcome. I am excited for this presentation and conversation.
Thank you so much, and welcome to everyone. I am so thrilled to be here. I really never expected in working on Thomas Law to be asked to talk about John Law, but given the focus this month and your ministry at All Souls, it really fits perfectly. And I hope that in my short presentation, you can see why John Law matters in the past as well as the present, and think about some connections between his life and your own congregation today and our own world today. And I'd love to take any questions that you have about John Law or Thomas Law, his father, or the world of Washington, D.C. In the period between about the 1790s and 1822. So with that, just a brief discussion of the highlights of his life. And as I say, I'll be willing to talk more in depth about any aspect that you would like me to pursue. In any case, I've been working on this book about Thomas Law for about 10 years now. And his son was John Law. John Law was born in India, in northern India, which you can see on this map, in probably Bihar. And that was where his father, Thomas Law, was stationed as a high-ranking East India Company employee, an administrator in the East India Company. The East India Company was the largest corporation in Britain in the 18th century. It's hard to imagine today how overpowering and overwhelming the power of the East India Company was at that time. But it had a monopoly on all the goods, including tea and spices and textiles and ceramics, and that were imported from China as well as India to England and to the rest of the world. In any case, as I say, Thomas Law was in northern India with the East India Company. He had arrived there in 1773, and he formed a relationship with a native woman, a woman whose name he never once mentions. And he has a lot of correspondence, a lot of writings, and he never mentions the woman's name. Her name, all he calls her is a woman in India. And he had a relationship with her, and he had 3 sons with her. Now, it was not unusual for these British East India Company employees to form relationships with these native women. It was frowned upon, but not forbidden at this time. He probably lived with her. She was perhaps a servant in his house. And we don't know for sure the nature of their relationship, although we do know it extended probably over the better part of a decade, in the 1780s. So John Law was the oldest of 3 sons, born in 1784. There were 2 other brothers. He was baptized in the Anglican Church in Calcutta. We have his baptismal record that notes that he was illegitimate, notes his father's name, but does not say anything about his mother. And I just highlight that just to point out what historians call the erasure of the native presence, the indigenous presence. And this occurs in many settler colonial societies. It occurs when we study US history and Native American relations, but you can see it here in colonial British India. In any case, Thomas Law, and I want to just give you a sampling of what one of these mixed race Anglo-Indian families might look at. This is contemporaneous, actually, when Thomas Law was over there. And it's a sort of stylized but beautiful portrait of a mixed race family. William Palmer was another high-ranking official in India. And you can see his native wife and his children. And it's just a very interesting portrait because you do see different skin tones in this portrait, but it's also a kind of idyllic portrayal, even perhaps a romanticized portrayal of those native relationships. Now, unlike most men who did have relationships with native women, when Thomas Law left, he abandoned his BB, as they were called, his female companion in India. He did leave a pension for her, but unlike most other patriarchs, East India Company men who had children, he actually brought his 3 sons with him back to England, and that was in 1791. He had become ill, and his doctor told him he had to leave or he might die. And so he left and went back to Great Britain, to London. And at that time, he was kind of interested in promoting some grand ideas for reforming the East India Company. He had already been successful in India in transforming the basis of taxation and land revenue collection there. And he went back to England filled with ambitious ideas about how he could continue to rise in the East India Company ranks. That was not to be. He was often rash and impulsive, and so he ran into trouble with the East India Company in London. And so in 1795, he left England and moved to the United States. He took 2 of the 3 sons with him, including the eldest, John Law. it should be noted that when he came to the United States, it wasn't clear at first whether he was going to stay permanently, but he quickly discovered that his experience in the British Empire in Asia seemed to have a lot in common with the emerging American empire on the North American continent. And it really fired his imagination. And what he did late in 1794 was to purchase large numbers of plots of land in the new capital of the United States, Washington, D.C. Now, just a little background here, little context. So after the ratification of the Constitution and the establishment of the new government, there was a provision for the establishment of a capital city, and Congress quickly decided that they would establish a new capital, and it would be at the location chosen by George Washington, the president, and he actually chose this site on the Potomac. But it was actually, there was Georgetown nearby and Alexandria, Virginia, but there was actually no city there. So Washington, D.C. had to be created from scratch, all the public buildings, the houses. And so beginning in 1791 too, the country engaged in this rapid effort to create a new capital where the new government would move in 1800. During the interim, it was first in New York City and then in Philadelphia, but in 1800, the capital would move to Washington, D.C. And really, there was not much there. I mean, really, it was a city created in the wilderness from scratch. And it was a public-private partnership, and individuals were asked to buy lots, and then on these lots they would build houses that would house congressmen and people who would be attracted to live in Washington, D.C. And Thomas Law was one of the biggest purchasers of lots in this new federal city. He also soon met George Washington, and by 1796 had married George Washington's step-granddaughter, Eliza Parke Custis. And he actually had a daughter with her. So John Law had a half-sister who was related to George Washington. And sometimes when I'm thinking about the Law family, I think about George Washington's mixed race grandchildren. And so I often get a kick out of that because I think it complicates our idea of George Washington's family. In any case, in these early years, Washington, D.C. was just starting to come into being. There wasn't very much there, few houses, few roads. It was a lot of tree stubs and rutted roads and not very much going on. And that's the world into which John Law moved in 1796. However, soon thereafter, John Law was sent to school. He probably didn't have much formal schooling while he was in India. So Thomas Law sent John Law for 2 years to what was called Georgetown College on the hilltop. And of course, that's Georgetown University today. And we have this wonderful alumni directory entry that shows that he attended Georgetown from 1797 to 1800. And I think that's a wonderful connection to DC that he established there. But he didn't graduate from college there. He went on to Harvard College in Cambridge, and he attended college there from 1800 to 1804. And he did graduate from there. And in all the list of firsts, I can't prove it, but I suspect strongly that John Law is the first Asian American graduate of Harvard College in 1804. I don't have a portrait of John Law, but this was a portrait, an image of his brother, Edmund Law, and we can sort of imagine that John must have looked something like that. you can see in many ways they have a very distinctive nose. And I think that's probably a law characteristic. In any case, after graduating from Harvard College in 1804, John Law went to Baltimore, where he read the law. That's what they called it at the time. They didn't have law schools. And he read the law and became a practicing attorney in Washington, D.C. in 1806. So what did he do there? Well, he did a lot of business transactions. There were a lot of property transactions. There were a lot of lawsuits. There were a lot of different kinds of issues that came up with the movement of the central government to Washington, D.C. He was the co-counsel in the impeachment trial of Justice Samuel Chase. He was on the prosecution team for General James Wilkinson, who was involved in the Burr conspiracy. He also was asked by President James Madison to help adjudicate land claims, land in the so-called Yazoo claims controversy, which was a very big deal. He handled a lot of his father's business matters for a lot of this time. Thomas Law moved to Philadelphia. He divorced his wife, Eliza Custis, in 1811. So he moved away from Washington, D.C., and John Law handled a lot of his father's property transactions and lawsuits. So he was a busy guy. He became a very highly respected member of Washington society. He was a member of the elite. He associated with members of Congress and with the wealthy individuals in the town. Remember, it was a very small town at this point, but it was an elite group that he associated with. He was also a very prominent civic leader. He led efforts to establish public schools in DC, or at least a couple of public schools, not a universal system, a penitentiary. He was involved with the Columbian Institute, which was a learned society. He sat on the board of the DC Canal Project and banks. He served in the DC militia during the War of 1812, and he was an alderman on the DC City Council. In 1822, he was elected president of the DC Board, which was the local government for Washington, DC at the time. He actually was asked to be the orator, the speaker at the laying of the cornerstone for the DC City Hall in 1820. In my opinion, though, one of the most important things that he did was to actually help free slaves legally. For a time, it was possible for slaves who had some claim to freedom, perhaps they could prove that their mother or their mother's mother was a free woman, that they could petition the courts in DC for their freedom, but they needed an attorney to represent them. And in many cases, John Law was the attorney of choice. So we have a number of petitions to the DC court where John Law acts as the representative for these enslaved people, where he acts to help free them legally. And he was a strong advocate of ending slavery, of abolition, and of the evils of slavery. So I think that's a wonderful connection with what Shige said about the origins of the connection you all have been investigating between Black people and Asian Americans. Of course, one of his other important acts was to participate in the founding of the first Unitarian Church, All Souls, in DC. As you know, the church was founded in 1822. He was listed among the donors along with his father, Thomas Law, and his brother, Edmund Law. Looks like he gave $100, but his brother only gave $50. And I think that's a sign of his commitment. It's also a sign of his status. And it's also a sign of where he had journeyed religiously along with his father. Thomas Law died in October 1822, probably during a yellow fever epidemic. He died rather suddenly. He left his wife, Frances Ann Carter, along with 2 young children. I think that John Law's life raises a lot of interesting questions about race, about early Washington, D.C., about identity, about religion. Interestingly enough, John Law became a naturalized US citizen in 1805. And that's somewhat remarkable because in 1790, the United States had passed the Naturalization Act, which specified that only white inhabitants could become citizens. So for whatever reasons, there was no question when John Law became a citizen that he was considered white. He had married a white woman, Frances Ann Carter, and as I say, had 2 sons. And so in that sense, there seemed to be no racial barrier to his participation in early DC society. And if you think about it, I think what's most striking is that John Law, along with his brother, did operate seemingly effortlessly in Washington society. Now, I should say Washington was a more diverse society than many cities in the United States, in that it had a lot of African Americans who were working on building the Capitol and working as artisans or shopkeepers in DC. You had a lot of Irish immigrants who were working in DC. And because it was the capital, you had people from a lot of backgrounds coming to DC. So he didn't, his ethnicity was not as obvious as it might have been, say, in a place like Boston. Still, I think what's most striking is that John Law was able to navigate Washington society successfully, partly because of his background, because of his education, his high educational attainment, his professional status as an attorney, his connections in Great Britain. He was related to 3 bishops in the Anglican Church and to a baron. And of course, because of his father's high standing and wealth in Washington, D.C. So he had a lot of advantages that people of color, other people of color, may not have enjoyed. But it's clear that that Law did not encounter many barriers. It's also true that there weren't very many other Indian Americans at this time, that is, people of Asian American or South Asian descent in America at this time. You might have found in a port city like Salem that did a lot of trade with India, it's sailors and immigrants who were of Asian descent, but not in other cities in the United States. So he was kind of an anomaly, and perhaps that helped him, as they say, navigate successfully in early Washington, D.C. In any case, that's sort of the factual background, and I hope that you have some questions. I know Shige and I can have things to talk about, but just let me know whatever you're thinking about, and I'll be happy to talk in more detail about anything. So I'm going to stop the PowerPoint and switch over to the people view.
Thank you. I probably have a couple questions, or we can just talk for a few minutes, and then I think Sunu will join, and certainly others, if you have questions, feel free to either just think of them for now and hold them, or potentially put it in the chat and we'll come to it. I don't know that everybody here will have read your chapter, your article about the mixed race family of Thomas Law. And I think one of the stories that I think would be most helpful for people to hear about is the lawsuit that would have bankrupted him. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about that, since some folks here don't know about it at all.
Okay, all right. So as I mentioned, John Law was willing to defend enslaved people who were attempting to gain their freedom through petition. And he was asked by 2 African Americans to defend them because they claimed that they had a white female ancestor, and they were suing for their freedom. Well, what happened then was, before the suit could be resolved, the master who lived in Maryland sold them to the Deep South, and they were basically untraceable. And the Law persisted in trying to gain their freedom, to locate them, to rescue them, but he was unsuccessful. But then what happened was the man who owned the slaves, Alexander Scott, came up in 1816 for a position, a patronage position. He was going to be appointed by James Madison to a lucrative position in the federal government. Well, John Law was not happy about that, and he actually lobbied in private against the appointment. And then he published a pamphlet where he laid out the whole story of how this Alexander Scott, in the weeks before his slaves got their hearing in court, sold them to the Deep South so that they couldn't have their opportunity for freedom. Well, he actually wasn't appointed. The Senate denied his appointment. And of course, he was furious. And so then what happened was Scott actually took him to court in a libel case, and the case was heard. And then the judgment went against him, and it was for thousands of pounds. And, that was just an enormous amount of money at that time. Now, as it happens, this was 1816. John Law died in 1822, but he had, even with his estate, selling everything, there was no way to make this up. And if he had lived, he would have lived under the shadow of bankruptcy for his entire life if Alexander Scott had pursued the claim aggressively. So, he really had to pay for his principles. He really suffered for his principles. And it really was a shadow over his widow and his children that he did die in such debt. And Thomas Law, his father, was forced to sort of clean up the mess. But again, he did do it in the service of this excellent and noble cause.
I think one of the things from your chapter that most struck me about that incident was also the specific, like, racialized, racist language that seemed to be directed at him in, I guess, the court proceedings in that bankruptcy. And so I think that leads me to my larger question, which is, how did people perceive him racially? Because I'm hearing a lot about, I think that he was perceived, or maybe not perceived as white, but treated as white, let's say. Yeah. But did people know that he was mixed, and how did they know that, or what do we know about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. They knew his father. They knew there was no mother. Thomas Law concocted some story about they knew he had been in India, about how the mother had been a high-ranking Brahmin princess, but there's absolutely no basis for believing that. So people knew that he was mixed race. He probably had what might be called an olive skin tone. Many Anglo-Indians had that kind of appearance. So they knew he was illegitimate. And I think it's important to take into account the illegitimacy probably weighed against him almost as much as his racial mixture at this time. But I think the point to make is that in most transactions, he performed whiteness. That's what, like, historians and cultural critics like to say. He performed whiteness, and he did it well. And because of his wealth or his, father's wealth, I suppose you could say, and his status and education, he could perform that part very well. So he was largely accepted by white society. But in moments of conflict or stress, as in this trial, as in this, when he was making these accusations against this white man for selling his slaves to the Deep South, then the deep prejudices came out. And, they called him a cur, and they said he was as black as the anaconda from whence he came. And so in those moments of stress, I think it's clear that people knew about his origins, that people always had that in the back of their minds about him. And so this was actually in private letters that were circulating to him and about him during this controversy. But it's an interesting thing how he was largely able to navigate this world, but when he ruffled feathers, especially in matters of race, that would come up.
Thank you. I think one more question from me for now, but that's really, can you tell us a little bit more about the Unitarian journey aspect of it for the father and for John?
Yeah. Okay. Well, as I mentioned, the Law family in England was very strongly connected to the Anglican Church. Thomas Law's father, that is John Law's grandfather, was a bishop. Three of his uncles were bishops. And so there was a strong Anglican connection. But in the last, say, quarter century of the 18th century, there were a lot of thinkers in England, William Paley among them, that were questioning some of the tenets of conventional Christianity. And I suppose you might say casting doubt on some of the more miraculous or unempirical dimensions of Christianity, and even casting doubt about the divinity of Christ per se. And they were sort of a fringe group at first. They talked about naturalistic religion, but Thomas Law was always an intellectual, and he was always reading and thinking about moral philosophy and writing about it. He actually published some pamphlets on moral philosophy where he explores some of these issues. And really, you can trace his journey from conventional Christianity to a more naturalistic philosophy, which eventually became, in some version, Unitarianism. And so I think by the time that the All Souls Church was established in 1822, he was just thrilled to shed conventional Anglicanism and to be able to associate with people who were more like-minded. He did not believe in the divinity of Christ. He was not persuaded by miracles. He believed in Christ as a sort of important teacher, but a lot of the theology that his brothers and father had accepted, he rejected. And, John Law per se did not write about these issues, but they were very close, John and Thomas Law. They both lived in the DC area, and I'm sure they talked about these issues over dinner and by the fireplace. And I am confident they made this intellectual and religious and spiritual journey together. And so I think that's what led all three Laws, the father, Thomas, and the two sons, Edmund and John, to give their donations when the All Souls Unitarian Church was established in 1822. I should note that unfortunately, John Law did die later in 1822, and his funeral was held at All Souls Church. And it is said that the Paul Revere bell was rung to announce his funeral.
Thank you. Sunu?
Hi everyone. Sunu Chandy. I remember at All Souls. Thank you, Shige, for setting this up. This was incredibly fascinating. My family's from India, and so I was not aware of this person, of Thomas Law or John Law. So I did get a chance to read the chapter, and I found it very interesting. In my day job, I'm a gender justice civil rights attorney, so I read it with very much of a feminist lens, and just was, as with many of our founding fathers in this country, incredibly disturbed by what are likely to be a lot of the power dynamics in terms of, you mentioned that she was probably a servant woman and, language like Native women. And then when I read the chapter, like he went off to England and was with the French mistress, and I don't know if there was a child related to that, and then came back and had, sounded like a Black woman who was working in his home and had a child with her as well. And I think this
You
is
did read it carefully. Yes. Yes, he
so it's
not only conventional gender roles, but I think sexual mores that kind of shocked some very conventional Americans. So sorry to interrupt, but
no, it's just it's hard to read that and then to sort of say, you know, you want to lift you up as a leader and a founder of this church. And all of these figures are incredibly complicated. And I just think we need to name what was happening there and not shy away from that element in the language we use and what was likely the scenarios. So that is something I really sort of was struck by. The other thing is I really appreciated how John Law was an advocate for these Black folks who are trying to gain their freedom, and at the same time faced incredible discrimination, not just from society relating to that incident you named, but from his own family. So this part was really incredible. He had a sister, a white sister, who did not invite these two brothers, even though they grew up as siblings, it sounds like, did not invite her two brothers who were mixed race to her own wedding. And he appealed to his father saying, how, you know, and he was angry with the father and the sisters because you grew up in one family. And it just sort of reminded me of like LGBTQ folks and families now, like you can be accepted, but you're not accepted. And so she didn't invite them. And it sounds like that was the end of their relationship, like with their sister, because she didn't invite them. And ultimately, I guess they reconciled with the father, even though they were really angry with the father as well. So I share all that to say there were a lot of incredible dynamics about acceptance and not acceptance that were happening at the same time for these folks, and also being an advocate for others while facing incredible bias in your own family and in society. And I thought that is, I think, very true today as well for lots of AAPI folks in this country, where we have maybe relative, some groups within the community, more access, more privilege, have an opportunity to be in solidarity, to use our access for racial justice, as we are also facing bias and discrimination. So those were some of the things that I pulled out of that, but really interested in, you know, how we grapple with people who we think are interesting, smart, supported the founding of this church. And, you know, we're probably engaged in like sexual violence on a regular basis, most likely.
or non fully consensual. I mean, just the power dynamics were, you know, very problematic. Yeah. But we can't know for sure, but it definitely is troubling. But John Law was good as far as we know. I mean, he was married and does not seem to have had, you know, he freed his slaves and he did not, you know, have that dynamic. The father, John Law, I mean, sorry, the father, Thomas Law, was a very problematic character. And, you know, it is, all you can say is people were complex, but it's not a justification. Yeah.
I only dipped a little bit into trying to find some of the history about this myself. And I did look at some archival newspapers to just find the obituaries about John Law. And that was the Daily Intelligencer, which was like the major Washington, D.C. paper. And that was a paper that was also edited, owned by Unitarians that were associated with our congregation. The people that I think were the pallbearers for John Law's funeral were on the one side, John Quincy Adams, who writes about some of this in his diary, but then on the other side, John Calhoun. And so, you know, as I was even looking at these like newspaper articles, I was seeing all kinds of like, you know, pro-slavery basically kinds of snippets, right? This or that auction is going to be taking place on this or that date, just as normalized, right? And that this was like coming out of our founders, right? This is our church's founders, who are all over the map on this, and who I would guess some of the theology that brought people together was more about what we're not than about who we are. Just, oh, we don't believe in the divinity of Jesus, or that sort of like anti-Trinitarian perspective. But I am not so sure myself, like what held the church together in terms of who we are. Maybe the rationalism piece, or the against certain kinds of like divine authority ideas. But I also found it kind of disturbing just to even look at those newspapers and be like, wow, like this person who's basically an abolitionist obituary is also in this newspaper that's like, come to this auction next week.
Yeah, well, and
it just
I
had
mean,
so much
I
cognitive.
think, you know, all the religious denominations in the United States face this question of slavery, and many of them did split, but not in the 1820s. In the 1820s, I think there was a kind of, you know, slavery exists outside the bounds of our religion, except of course among Quakers, who were very early anti-slavery advocates. Uh, it's my recollection, maybe somebody in the audience knows, I thought the Unitarians eventually did split over slavery. Does anybody know if that's true?
I don't know that the faith did, but I can tell you at All Souls that there was a minister in the 1850s, Moncure Conway, who was
Right.
pushing too much of an anti-slavery message for the congregation that they basically fired him. He went to Cincinnati. He ultimately ended up in England. So there's a long story there, but there's been struggle around that.
Yeah. But a lot of denominations did actually split. And so, but that was more by the 1850s. So in the 1820s, I think it was more, we'll keep politics outside of the church. And as you were suggesting, let's rally around our beliefs, because, you know, Unitarians were, of course, a minority, and, you know, they were just getting established in the United States. So, so I think that's just an important point, that in one sense it was good that these people of such diverse views found a place where they had common ground. But on the other hand, it's interesting that there was not a stronger stance on slavery at this point by in many religious denominations, including Unitarianism.
I want to just point out the question from Georgia in the chat. I don't know if you see that, Rosemary, or if we know, if anyone knows if his descendants attended the All Souls after he died.
Well, probably not, because both John Law and Edmund Law predeceased Thomas Law. His grandsons actually moved out and went to college in Illinois and settled there. Yeah, the white daughter lived in Baltimore and had children in Baltimore. That's an interesting question. I bet they were Episcopalian, though. I don't know for a fact, but I would bet, because she married into an elite family in Baltimore. But yes, that's a good question.
Judy? I don't know if you're allowed to. Do we have to? Hold on.
Yeah. I want to make sure that I'm understanding the context here and whether or not there's truth to something. I've heard that enslaved people were used to build the U.S. Capitol building, which would have been happening around 1800? Is that the approximate time when they were moving the Capitol here? And, you know, my assumption is that yes, enslaved people were helped build the building. What do you know about that?
That's absolutely true. The Capitol was being built from about 1792 to past 1800 when the government moved here, but the buildings weren't finished. So a lot of local slave owners, especially in, you know, Virginia, but also in Maryland, had excess slave labor, and they would hire out their slave laborers to the government or to whoever was building the buildings. And so a lot of enslaved labor was used in building the public buildings in Washington, D.C. during the 1790s. So it's, I think what it goes to show is that you cannot separate our early history from the institution of slavery wherever you look. And that without reckoning with that, you just cannot understand the complexity of our racial past.
No.
And relating to something that was mentioned before, the issue of the slave trade in the nation's capital became an increasingly contentious issue, as you probably know, culminating in the Compromise of 1850, where it was finally prohibited. But, the fact that not only were people enslaved in the capital of the free world, in the capital that celebrated liberty for all, but that slaves were bought and sold was really a point of contention. I don't know if you noticed that image that I have, but it said home of the oppressed, and it was a slave gang with the US Capitol in the background. And that was really, truly the contradiction of slavery and freedom was at its most stark and appalling, when people thought about slavery in the nation's capital.
Thank you. Who else?
Oh, somebody asked if slaves were involved in building the first Unitarian church. I don't know at all. It just depends on what labor they were able to obtain. As I say, there were a lot of Irish workers, but there was a labor shortage. And so one of the reasons they hired enslaved people was because it was hard to get laborers. Now by 1822, 1820s, maybe it was less acute, but that would be something for you to research, Shige.
Or someone. Yeah, someone.
If there aren't other questions, I'm interested in, Rosemary, why you selected this topic, or what brought you to it, or what you think we can learn from it, or how knowing this and knowing these complexities helps us sort of figure out what needs to happen in our current day and age.
Well, I was attracted by Thomas Law's interesting story, this global voyager who had a life on 3 continents in the late 18th and early 19th century, and by his multiracial family, and by, the gender dynamics in his various relationships with women. But I think the larger point that I'm interested in is this question of empire. And for a long time, the United States has denied, people in the United States have denied that the United States was an empire, had imperial aspirations. But by thinking about the early United States in the same framework as the British Empire in India, and by looking at the sort of vision of Thomas Law, who had deep experience in both places, you see the comparisons. You see the extent to which the impulse for building an empire is similar in both places. And I think a lot of Americans don't acknowledge that today, that, if they acknowledge America as an empire, they say, oh, that began in 1898, with the conquest of the Philippines or something. But I think my point is that the United States was an empire from the very beginning. And one of the things that Thomas Law was interested in doing was actually this is for Thomas Law, something that he tried to do. One, he was against slavery himself, although he did own slaves for part of the time that he lived in the United States. He freed them eventually, but he was interested in finding ways to end slavery in the United States. And he was also interested in creating pathways to avoid buying sugar from the slave islands, the Caribbean islands. And so he thought that importing sugar from India would be a way to circumvent enslaved labor growing the sugar crop. And so he actually built an India wharf down on the Anacostia River near where the Nats Stadium is today. And he built a sugar house where he was going to process sugar. And that was in the cause of free labor. So that was one way he was trying to sort of convey or transfer his understanding of India to the United States. And I would say that would be, a more positive way in which his imperial vision was useful. Another way was in India, he had come up with a plan to change the basis of taxation and revenue collection for the East India Company, which basically functioned as the government of Northern India. And his plan was that this would devolve private property to a certain class of people in India. He actually had a plan to do the same thing for Native Americans. And so throughout the first couple of decades of the 19th century, since he was friends with all the presidents, he kept promoting a plan to try and devolve private property to Native Americans. And he believed that this would improve the lot of Native peoples and prevent their extinction or extermination. He got no hearing for that in the United States. People, leaders, settlers, governments were not interested in considering that. I mean, that it was a settler colonial society where the needs of the white settlers were predominant and in fact overwhelming. So what I find interesting here is that, there are these definite imperial views that he tried to transfer from British India to the early United States, but with much less success than he had in India. There were less positive aspects of his vision too, where he assumed the superiority of Western ideas. He did believe in universal humanity, that all people were basically the same, but he also believed that Western cultures were superior to Native cultures. And so he wanted to impose Western cultures on Native peoples. And he really didn't understand or grant any authority to Native cultures or see any value in it. And I think on the personal level, this comes out in his relationship with women. There's some incidents in the way he talks about his Native companion in India that are absolutely appalling. He would never consider a woman of color to be a potential wife. And the way he talks about womanhood and wifehood is strictly in terms of conventional Western gender roles that only a white woman could aspire to or conform to. And so I think what I am trying to do is really show how if you think about the early United States through the lens of Thomas Law and his family, you see some strong global and cross-cultural currents, both in ideas and in people, that make you see that the United States was an empire from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Thank you for spending this time with us. Oh, I think, Barbara, you can have the last question.
Well, I have a quick question. I was interested in the racial classification issue. My thesis in law school, the last year of law school, was under A. Leon Higginbotham, who wrote a book about Blacks in the law. And to the extent that I knew nothing about Asian Americans and where they fit in terms of race, I was very curious about the Naturalization Act and whether or not they had to prove they were white, or whether or not they simply applied for citizenship and, you know, a court decided that they were white, based on something, some evidence or something. And two, I was curious as to whether or not you had found a census record of either the father or the sons, which, you know, declared something. I don't know what it would have said. I don't know whether there was a box for Asian or a box for Chinese or whether there was any box at all. But I was just curious because the first census was in 1790 and there were some in 1800. So I would assume that they would have caught all three of them at some point.
Yeah.
I was curious.
Okay, first, those are good questions. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know which, the early censuses did not have any classifications except free or slave. And so they didn't even have specific ages, they had age ranges. So they're much less detailed than what they became even by the Civil War. So these 1790, 1800 censuses, yes, they are there, and I can find out kind of where they lived, and I found out how many slaves Thomas Law owned before he freed them, you know, but, you know, I just can't find out how they were identified or self-identified. So that's, you know, too bad. On the question of the Naturalization Act, again, the government was much less bureaucratized at this time. They were just sort of inventing it as they went along. And so my understanding is that you just presented yourself. I mean, they didn't even have passports at this time. So, you know, you just present yourself at the office. And I think if you looked white, they accepted you as white. And since they probably were not Black in the sense that a lot of African Americans were Black, they were accepted as white. And also, if they were known to the bureaucrat who was taking their application, again, this performing of whiteness would have trumped any considerations they would have had about their racial identity based on skin color. And so it just was a different way of running a society. But the fact that they put white specifically into that 1790 Naturalization Act is extremely significant. I can't remember the date, but I do believe in the early 20th century, there was a case, maybe you know it or somebody knows it, where a person from India was declared Black. And so later on in American history, you know, as racial qualifications and restrictions got more and more elaborate, Indians were for a time regarded as non-white. So that did happen, but it wasn't happening at this point. And again, I think that at this time, you know, the ambiguity worked in Edmund Law's and John Law's favor. And so they were by decree declared to be white. Mm-hmm. You know, and of course there is a long history of African Americans who escaped to freedom, or in the case of Thomas Jefferson, were given their freedom, who looked white and could pass as white. And so they too, you know, benefited from a system that more or less took people at face value at this time and didn't require extensive documentation about origins. Now that's in contrast to actually what John Law was doing in those petitions to the DC court, where slaves were asked to provide evidence either through testimony or witnesses or whatever, that someone, a woman, mother, grandmother, ancestor, had been free and white. So there you do start. Oh, somebody said, oh, in 1923, thank you, US versus Singleton. That's it. That's the case. So, so in any case, it just was a different era in the United States in the development of the bureaucracy of the US government and in the sort of norms for racial passing. But thank you for that question.
So Dr. Zagari, I don't know if you have a few more minutes to be with us tonight or how you're feeling about that.
Well, if there are more questions, I'm happy to take them, but if people
okay, because I
have
sense
to leave,
I sense
that's
there
fine.
might be more. We advertised it as a 90-minute event, although I know we talked about it probably only being 60 minutes. I think that there's a few more that might want to come in or say a thing. Were there a few more?
Someone did mention the case. I don't know, do you know about the case? Does anyone know about this case, US versus Singleton?
Georgia's.
No?
Georgia, are you still on? She's the one that cited the case.
Yeah. All I know is the finding that, you know, the person who was from India was declared Black. So.
Yeah, my recollection was he was trying to do something. He was a businessman, and actually he ended up losing all of his. My recollection is because they would not recognize him as a white person and give him the privileges of that. He ended up committing suicide because he felt like he had no options.
Wow.
He had a family. He was, a businessman, and effectively ended up becoming someone who he was not allowed to own property because he wasn't white. And so as a result, he committed suicide. And It was a very tragic case, but yeah. And then, I was curious because I know, like, enslaved people, if you were born to a woman who was enslaved, you were enslaved. And in this case, it sounds like the race of the mother matters less. And it's more of a.
No, it matters completely, because like in these freedom suits, if you could prove, say, you had a grandmother who was free, Black or white, that race, your enslavement descended through the mother only. And so that's why it was important to be able to say, oh, I had a Native American grandmother and I shouldn't be enslaved, or my mother was a free Black woman and I was enslaved, and that's an error. But you needed to get testimony from witnesses who would testify to that and say that you were free. And that's what John Law was trying to do in the case of the two Black men who were sold to the Deep South before the case could be heard. So slavery descended through the mother.
Right. I was recognizing that, but I wondered what happened to Asian people, because I don't know if that would have been true for Asian people. There were no Asian women in this country China.
Right. I think that's what partly makes, the case of the Law brothers so interesting but anomalous. There just weren't that many Asian people or South Asian people in the United States at this time. There might have been small numbers in port cities that traded with China or India. So that would be like Salem, Massachusetts, Philadelphia, possibly New York, but it was a handful. It was just small numbers, very small numbers.
The first Chinese woman who came as a sideshow for the circus, basically.
Oh,
Yeah. Small, and she had bound feet, so she was
wow.
with bound feet. But yeah, women were not allowed to immigrate. So anyway, let's ask their questions.
Thank you for that citation. I really appreciate that.
Judy?
I'm just your description, Professor, of how unbureaucratic but fluid that an understanding of race was back then. As another bit of perhaps another urban legend that I've heard was when Europeans were settling the country, especially from Italy. a lot of Southern Italians were olive skinned, and there was a point, and they were called awful names. You know, there was a lot of discrimination. And then somewhere at some point, and I understand maybe the early 20th century, someone decided that Italians are white. And, you know, what do you know about that? This isn't, you know, it's the issue of color and color lines.
But it wasn't just the Italians. The Italians didn't come in large numbers until the 1880s and 90s and the early 20th century. Before them, Irish people started emigrating, Irish Catholics in the 1840s, and they were called Black. They were called Black. And the discrimination against Irish, especially Catholic Irish, was rampant. And there were actually anti-Irish, anti-Catholic riots in Philadelphia in the 1840s. And actually my colleague, Zach Schrag, just wrote a book about these riots. So it's a very interesting process of, I guess you would call assimilation, where some of these groups are othered, if you want to use that term, when they first come over, and only with time, only with a losing, discarding of their native culture and language and traditions and prosperity, do some of these groups start to be considered white. And, you know, it's just a very fascinating process, because just because these groups have endured discrimination, such as the Irish and Italians, doesn't mean they don't discriminate and continue to discriminate against Black people. And so I think it's worth reminding Americans, especially since so many Americans have immigrant roots, that they were not always of a privileged white status, and they should, oh yes, very good, Whiteness of a Different Color by Matthew Fry Jacobson. You know, and yes, How the Irish Became White, right? So yes, I just love for, especially those who are no longer students, to be aware of this complex immigration history and of the racial implications of that. So thank you for that question.
Taquina, were you wanting to still ask something or say something?
I think what I was going to offer was already mentioned. One of the things I'm wondering about, because I'm also reading a book about, it's called Sex and Family in Colonial India.
You are reading that book?
Yes, I'm reading that.
For fun?
Well, my sister and I interviewed the author about Bridgerton, because we're looking at how—
That's a fantastic book, very influential for my work. Yes, yes.
Yeah. So we're looking at how historical drama now is also wrestling with representation and the different ways that it is approached, the kind of what if of a Bridgerton. And you mentioned the sugar boycott that Thomas Law was, and in Sanditon, that's part of the plot line.
Oh, I don't watch Bridgerton, but that's fascinating. Yes, yeah. They called it, free sugar, but not that you didn't have to pay for it, but that it was made by people other than slaves. Of course, the labor in India was totally exploited, but yes.
But it's interesting because what we were kind of exploring is what we were exploring the piece around erasure of the mothers.
Yes,
and
that's Durba Ghosh is the author, right?
Yes, Durba Ghosh. And how, particularly now with DNA research, folks are discovering that these women who were erased are actually part of their maternal line. I think Princess Diana actually traces her an ancestor, or her, at least her DNA, to India. So this kind of, there's a kind of escapism. I call Bridgerton like the Disneyfication of history, And then you have the PBS masterpiece approach with Sanditon, which is trying to really reckon with what was possible, but also looking at the shadows that made the wealth of Britain possible. And I was just wondering, for you as a historian, do you engage in any of that kind of conversation around, how in reckoning with history and trying to bring people back in who existed, those different approaches to doing that?
I've been on a couple of documentaries, but not a consultant on a big budget, fictional type of series. But, I'm very supportive of those kinds of series in the sense that they do expose a popular audience to situations and relationships that they may not have considered existed before the 21st century. And what I always hope is that these kinds of productions raise questions that people then pursue historically, rather than, like, as you say, the Disneyfication, that they don't take that as historical fact. So, I mean, obviously you're interested in, understanding the extent to which what is portrayed in Bridgerton is factually based, but a lot of people, I'm afraid, don't. But still, I do think it exposes people to a past that they thought was all white,
Yeah,
and
that's
that if only in that it's something important. So
and that's the point that Derva Ghosh makes, that there was always this multiracial history. It's just that it was never shown.
yes. Well, and especially with these British in India, I mean, it's just fascinating. And most of the children were left there, and they had a terrible problem of orphans, of these mixed race orphans who were not accepted in Calcutta, and who were not accepted by the native peoples, and whose fathers had abandoned them, and who had a very hard time, especially the girls, faring in that society. So the English did establish some orphanages and charitable societies, but the problem was a lot bigger than that. But anyway, that's an exciting connection. Thank you for that.
Emily, did you still have a question or comment you wanted to make?
Me? No, I took my hand down. It was answered. Thanks.
Okay. I think this is probably a good spot to wrap up. I appreciate the Disneyfication, because I think that's the hard thing for me sometimes, and congregational and all these histories, is sometimes you want to read something and you want to either be proud or you want to be like, that's the wrong kind of Unitarian that we don't like. And I think sometimes it's awkward, and you can't, I don't know, for me at least, my processing of some of it is like, there is not always like everything falls into good and bad piles. There's probably a bit of bad everywhere, or a lot of it, and sometimes a bit of good. I hope that this event has sparked some thoughts for people. And as I was saying at the beginning, I feel like I'm going to want to watch the recording of this just to try to even remember some of all this very dense and amazing information from Dr. Zagari. Thank you so much for doing this.
And I'd just like to say, if anyone has any other questions or thoughts, you can look me up at George Mason University History Department, and I'm happy to continue the dialogue. I really appreciate your engagement and your interest and your activism today, because these issues go back to our founding period, but we are still living with the consequences today. And so the more we know, I hope the more we can combat the legacies of the period.
Thank you. And I do have a very quick also closing reading. This is a brief piece from Worship Web, the UUA's website, entitled "The Song is Best Sung with Others." It's written by UU minister, Reverend Manish Mishra Mazzetti. The universe sings no less because time and space wear us thin. The music calls us to recognize our limitations, to recognize that the song is best sung with others. So with that, I hope this evening's stories, while complicated, provide food for reflection and meaning making. I wish you all well this evening and that you have a good night. Thank you.
It was great.
Thanks. Bye. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much.